I like to maybe move around a little bit, but also I like to show images, I'm afraid, because I realize that visibility is not terrific, but that's just about all I've got to do is to show. So I'm going to show and also tell, and hopefully you guys can see. I've called this St. Clair from the ground up. It's not just St. Clair. I'm going to be speaking about, obviously, areas around St. Clair, how they grew up, but how they grew up not in the usual way that we think about suburbs, which is, with big roles to professional developers and builders and lenders and federal government and this, that, and the other. In the early days, this is an area, and especially the area of Earl's Court that I'm going to be looking at. And Ed Keenan yesterday said, hello, Earl's Court, so I appreciated that shout out. But basically, these were areas that were built from the ground up by amateurs, by people themselves, self-builders, owner-builders, call them what you like. And that has interested me, and that's in large part, that's part of what I'm speaking about. I'm also going to be talking about streetcars, because everyone has to speak about streetcars. I realize that. So hopefully, I don't know whether you can even see that image. It's a Lauren Harris painting, no relation of mine. But it shows what you see there, or should see there, is chickens and mud and people really doing whatever it takes to make some kind of a living. And also, almost certainly, what you're looking at are houses that were owner-built. So I'm going to give you first a little bit of a context to what was happening, not just in Earl's Court, but in this area as a whole in the early 20th century. We're going back basically a century. I don't know how much of that you can see, but can anyone actually see these? That's the old city limits there. The city was expanded. This is the area that I'm talking about, that we're in now. Up around St. Clair. What you should also be able to see on this map, I don't know whether you can, is the built-up area. Basically, of course, this was outer suburban Toronto, as Jay was speaking about a little bit earlier today. This was outer suburban Toronto in the early 20th century. If we're thinking about suburbanization today, certainly, we think about the car. And yes, here is a car in outer suburban Toronto in 1916, I think, 1918. But that's not the way that this area grew up. This is not something that people depended on. This was a visitor, actually, of the Canadian Commission of Conservation visiting the area in 1918, or the area probably just rather north of here. So you might be thinking, oh, okay, well, so this is an area that, it's a streetcar suburb, and some of you may be familiar, urban historians anyway, you'll certainly be familiar with a book by Sam Bass-Warner called Streetcar Suburbs, about the sort of the pattern, the process of growth in Boston in the late 19th century, and you can go into the early 20th century, and lots of American cities in particular, and this is an image of Cleveland that you're looking at there in the 1920s. A lot of American cities as late as the 1920s, suburban growth depended on the extension of streetcar lines out into suburban areas, and then settlement happened because that's where the streetcars were located. Well, as I think a number of you know, in Toronto, that is not the way things happened in this general area. Settlement happened despite the absence of streetcars. And in fact, the streetcar line, of course, along St. Clair was built in the early teens by the City of Toronto because, and I don't know how much of this you can see, the Toronto Railway Company, these were the lines of the TRC, and this is where they ended, which was basically at the old City of Toronto municipal limits, and the TRC simply refused to extend its lines beyond. That's why the city got involved in the teens, building lines along the Danforth here, but also up along St. Clair. But a lot of settlement had happened before that happened, and a lot of settlement continued to happen north, and this is the area up including Earl's Court, which I mentioned earlier. A lot of settlement happened well beyond the streetcar lines. So this isn't automobile suburbs, this is not streetcar suburbs, at least initially. This was, as I say, built from the ground up and people just did a lot of walking. Part of the context, of course, is that this was a period of extraordinary growth. I mean, we're accustomed to thinking of Canada as a place which has always attracted immigrants and grown fairly rapidly. But the period, this is 1900 to 1910, annual population growth rate for Canada was at an all-time high by comparison with more recent years. This is prospective. Ditto, Toronto city and suburbs almost doubled in size in the first decade of the 20th century, and 50% again in the teens despite the First World War. So annual growth rates of 6.5%, this is extraordinary, really by almost any standard, certainly by any Canadian standard. Fort McMurray maybe. And of course it was driven by immigration. This graph, I hope you can see it, shows absolute numbers of immigrants, and it also shows the immigration rate, and that was the peak. We think we get a lot of immigrants today, but the rate of immigration per capita of the population, of the currently resident population of Canada, there's just absolutely no comparison. That was an era of phenomenal immigration. But, and this is where I have to disagree with Ed Keenan and the motto of the City of Toronto, this was not a period of diversity. The immigrants were overwhelmingly from the British Isles. So unless you count, let's say, the Welsh as being foreign, and actually my mother would have, she had a thing about the Welsh. But unless you count the Welsh and the Scots as foreign, then this was not a period of diversity. This was not a period of people coming from all over the place. This was overwhelmingly British immigrants, such as these folks here, just off, just out of Union Station. What about the process of change? I've already given you some hint of that in terms of the owner building. There were, as I say, hundreds of thousands of people moving to Toronto. The building industry wasn't able to cope. So what happened was that, and you're not going to be able to read this, it's the Dovercourt Land and Building Company, if I've got their name right, Dovercourt Land Company. Basically, land subdividers subdivided land in this area, as in many other parts of Toronto, sold off the lots. They weren't interested in building. They just sold off lots, unserviced, no water, no sewer, no nothing, no electricity, to people and sold them at, well, $3 a front foot. Those were the days. And people bought the lots and built themselves shacks. Literally, shacks. At least that's what they started out with. In the hundreds and the thousands. This is, I don't know how well you can see that, but I really like this view because it gives you a sense of the landscape that was being created at that time by owner builders. And you see houses, you see shacks down in the left foreground there, as well as slightly more substantial homes which have been improved over time. The level of home ownership, not surprisingly, all these people buying cheap suburban lots, building their own homes, they were homeowners, right? So the level of home ownership in Toronto boomed from, trying to point, around 30%, below 30%, in fact, in 1901, up to, by the early 1920s, up around 50%. So it's really that era that Toronto became a city of homes, if we mean what we mean by homes is people owning their homes. Great for the kids, the boys and girls flying kites. Actually, it's only the boys flying the kites. It's the few girls in that picture who are observing, but anyway. This was accessible, this was an area, even in its early settlement, to a few jobs. There were certainly factories in the general vicinity. People might have to walk a fair distance. Like I said, no streetcar. Canada Foundry was one. You can see it in the far distance there. And on this map here, you can see, among other employers, you can see Willis Overland, which was a car company in the good old days. Stockyards, of course. Kodak was built in the teens. was sort of the furthest out of these factories. There's the Willis Overland plant in 1930, and Kodak in Mount Dennis, just really as it was being built in 1917. So, you know, these folks who had moved out to this general vicinity, yeah, there were some jobs nearby, but lots and lots of people had to, and did, commute much further. So this is actually a map showing the work location of people who lived in this area, South Earls Court, just north of St. Clair. This is where they worked in 1911, so very early on in the period of settlement. And as you can see, sure, there were some people fairly close by in the junction and so forth. Lots and lots of people downtown as well. So what they were doing was walking a mile or maybe more to the end of a streetcar line, the city's streetcar line, and then having to make a transfer onto the onto the car of the private company that ran the streetcar system in the city of Toronto, the core of the city of Toronto. So it was a long, long, long trip, is what I'm trying to say. Times were difficult. People struggled. There was a recession. The winter of 1907, 1908, people were starving, literally. A cartoon from the Globe early in 1908. During the First World War, there were campaigns run to provide coal for people living in this area because they couldn't afford, for heating purposes, couldn't afford coal. Fire service. This was the fire service struggling through the mud in 1912. Volunteer, of course, fire service. No paved roads. Outcome? Well, I've already talked about the shacks and the way that they were improved over time. This is a pair of images, in fact, put out it was in a publication of the Earls Court Methodist Church, which played a really, really crucial part in community building in this area in that period. And one of the images from this pamphlet of theirs said, well, you know, this was a home, and then a couple of years later, how it had been obviously replaced and improved. The cover of the book that I've written about this process includes yet another Lauren Harris painting, January Thaw, Edge of Town. It's the Earls Court area, showing the variety of types of structures. And jumping back about a decade, a couple of visitors from England who crossed Canada. They were trying to promote immigration from the British Isles to Canada, and they crossed the country but stopped in Toronto, went to Earls Court, and one of them painted this watercolor showing the stages of development in Earls Court. People start with this and end up in due course with that. But I think you're getting the message there. One of the things that happened, there were annexations, and Jay mentioned this a little bit earlier. There were annexations of part, at least the southern portion of the area, certainly including the areas immediately around St. Clair. There were annexations in the teens, and as soon as these areas were brought within the city in 1912 passed a bylaw that compelled people to install sanitary conveniences, sanitary improvements. You had to hook up to the water lines that were in existence in these areas. And if you look at the map which I've produced of the areas where people were compelled to hook up, and thereby doubling their property assessments, I might add, you can see a huge cluster out in the East End, yes, but also very much in this area here. And as you might imagine, some people resisted that, didn't like it, didn't like to pay twice as much in taxes, but even, you know, with getting piped water, but it happened. And so you can see this. Here's a couple of shacks, which obviously the sidewalk's just been put in, and they've been improved with sanitary conveniences. Finally, yes, a streetcar did go in, not just on St. Clair, but Rogers Road, and I think this is the opening ceremony in 1925. By then, of course, the streetcar system was run by the TTC. They took over in 1921. And as you can see, this is an area that was completely built up on both sides, all around that area, completely built up by that point in time. In other words, preceding the streetcar, not following it. But also, as you can also get, I think, a pretty clear sense here, the celebrations. Right? How valued the streetcar was. And then, of course, moving into the early post-war period, the post-Second World War period, we get a different wave of immigrants, obviously Italian immigrants, and that's when, at least in this area, I would argue that the diversity began. Thank you.